In this video, I will talk a bit more about classes and objects. We will talk about copy constructors, the equals method to compare objects of the same class, as well as aggregation. What is a copy constructor? A copy constructor is a constructor that creates a copy of an existing object of the same class. Have a look at this piece of coding. We have two fields for the subject class, subject code and subject name. So every subject object will have a subject name and a subject code. Let's have a look at the first constructor. This is the normal constructor. So if we create a new object using this constructor, we set the subject code as TPG10, AB as passed into the constructor. We set the subject name as technical programming 1 to create this green subject object in memory. If we then use the copy constructor call to create a new object, we pass in the existing green subject object in order to make a copy of it as the new object. So how do we make a copy of an object? We need to copy all the fields of the object we want to copy to the fields of the new object that will be constructed. So now for our blue object, we set the subject code the same as the subject code of the green passed in object, and we set the subject name of the blue object to the subject name of the green object. And now we made a copy of the green object. It is very important to realize that although these objects are now identical, they exist in memory at two different locations. The subject variable will hold the memory location of the green object, and the copy of subject variable will hold the memory location of the blue object. So if we have the following statement, if subject with two equal signs copy subject, it means that we are testing to see if the memory locations of the objects are the same. In this example, they exist at two different memory locations, so this if statement will result in a false value, even though the two objects are exactly the same. So how can we then test if two objects of the same class are in fact identical? We need to write the equals method. Your equals method will need to return a Boolean value as we are testing to see if two objects are equal or not. You will also need to pass in a subject object that's an object of the same class to compare this to. It is very important now to realize that by calling this equals method, we have a subject object that calls the method and a subject object that was passed into the method. Our green object in this statement is the object that calls the equals method, and the blue object is the object that was passed into the method. In order to compare objects to see if they are the same, we need to compare all the fields of the one object with all the fields of the other object. So we will compare the subject code of the green object with the subject code of the blue object. The this keyword here refers to the object that called the method. In this case, it's the green object. Then we also compare the subject name of the green object with the subject name of the blue object. Only when all fields of the green object are equal to all of the fields of the blue object will they be exactly the same, and will the equals method return true. Right, so let's look at these concepts quickly in IntelliJ or in the Java coding. So in this project, you can see that I've got a driver class, which has got my main method. I've got an exam paper class, I've got a student class, and a subject class. So we'll get to the exam paper and the subject class, the exam paper and the student class later on. Let's first look at the subject class that we just did. So in the subject class, you can again see that we've got two fields right at the top, and those two fields make up the object. We've got a normal constructor that accepts the subject code and the subject name, and we set the subject code and the subject name to our object's values. So remember here in the constructor that this keyword refers to the object that you're currently constructing. So which means that the one that I'm currently constructing subject code should be the subject code that was passed in, and the one I'm currently creating, that one's subject name will be equal to the one that was passed in. Then if we look at the copy constructor quickly again, the copy constructor is always the same name as the class because it's a constructor. Also no return value, not even void. And then if we go to what it accepts in brackets, it will basically be the same object of the class. So you can see it's the same name as the class, subject, and then you can call your object whatever you want there. In this case, we call it subject again. So now what happens in the copy constructor is that the object that will be made or that's currently being constructed is referred to with the this keyword again. So we're saying the one that you're constructing now, that one's subject code should be the object that was passed in's subject code. And the subject name of the one that you're currently constructing should be the subject name of the object that was passed in. So that's the copy constructor. If we quickly have a look at the equals method again, all equals methods normally, well, most of the time, we return back a Boolean value, either true or false, yes, they're the same, or no, they're not the same. And then we also accept an object of the same class, because that's what the whole idea behind the equals method is, to compare two objects of the same type. So now in this if statement, we basically just say this dot subject name. So remember, with the equals method, there's a calling object and there's an object that was passed in. So if we go to the driver class quickly, you can see that I've created two subjects there. Can you see both of them are exactly the same? So how do we use this equals method? We will say subject1 dot equals subject2. So always there's an object, subject1, that calls the equals method. That's the one with the dot. So it calls the equals method, and then there's an object that was passed in, which is subject2. So if we go back there, the this keyword refers to the one calling the equals method, and then obviously object is the one that was passed in there. So I refer to it by just saying object.subjectName or .subjectCode. So the idea behind the equals method is to compare both fields in the one object with both fields in the other object. So if we look at this quickly, we're saying the calling object's subject name, if it's equal to the object that was passed in's subject name. Now, because subject name and subject name at the top, you can see all of them are strings. Remember that you compare strings with also the string class's equals method. So this equals method here is not referring to our equals method, but it refers to the string class equals method in order to compare two strings. So I'm checking if the calling object's subject name is equal to the one that was passed in subject name. And at the same time, the calling object's subject code is the same as the object that was passed in's subject code. So if both the values of the one object is the same as both the values of the other object, then we return true, because then they're exactly the same. The else one will be to return false. So remember that you can do this in only one line of coding. I can remove all of that, and I can just say there return, and then add my semicolon there. So whatever this whole Boolean expression returns, I will return as well as the equals method. Okay, and then we've got get the normal getters and setters there. And then one other method that I quickly want to introduce is the toString method. So if you look at this one quickly, in the driver class, we've created two objects there. There's object 1 and object 2, or subject 1 and subject 2. We check if they are the same. They should be the same if we run it now. So let's run it. It should print out they are the same, because they are exactly the same. So you can see they are the same. Now look at this printout at the bottom, this line there. You can see I'm just printing out the object called subject1. And you can see the way it prints out, it gives me basically my package name there, and then my class name inside of the package, and then it's a hash code of the memory location of this object. So it's actually something that doesn't make sense for the user if printed out at all. So what we need to do is to go back to our subject class and override the default toString method that comes with every class. So I'm going to go down to the subject class, and at the bottom I'm going to add a method called public string toString. Now the toString method is used to basically explain what is happening in your specific object. So because we're going to look at in the few next videos that's coming, we're going to have a look at inheritance, and we'll talk a bit more about the add override tag there. But basically what happens here is that we are overriding a toString method of the class that inherits, or the main class of all classes has got a toString method. But that main class of all classes is basically printing out this, and that's not what we want. So we're going to create our own toString method. So it must be exactly like this. It must be public string toString, exactly like that. then we're overriding it. And then we're going to return a string value now. So instead of printing out the object and it looks like this, whatever you return now is what it will print out there. So I'm going to say return. In my subject, I've got a subject code and a subject name. So let's say subject information. We'll say subject information, and then let's add a new line character there so that we go to a new line. And then on the new line, I'm going to say subject code and display the subject code. Then I'm going to go to a new line again, and then we'll have then it's a subject name, so we're going to call it subject name and display subject name. And then maybe, I think after that one we can leave it open. Okay, so this is now the toString method. So if we run this again, it's exactly the same coding in the driver class, but we changed some coding in the subject class. So if you run it now, you can see it prints out whatever you type there as the return statement in your toString method. So the toString method is basically a method that describes your object. So normally in the toString method, we will print out all the fields that we have at the top to explain our object. Right, so let's go to the student class. The student class is a class that I've created now, which you can also go and create by just right-clicking on the package and say new Java class. And you create that class called student, and then you can add these two fields. So we've got two fields, a student name and then a student number. So let's first create the constructor. So there's an easier way in IntelliJ to actually generate your constructors. So I'm going to say generate, right click there, then you go down to generate and you say constructor there, and choose the two fields that you want your constructor to actually accept as parameters there. So you can see that we're basically setting those fields again like that we did in the subject class. We're saying student name was passed in, so we change our student name to the student name that was passed in, and our student number to the student number that was passed in. So let's see if we can create a copy constructor quickly. So a copy constructor will be the exact same name as your class. So again, it will be student, but instead of accepting both these values again, we will accept a whole student object. And remember that student object also has got those two values. So it's just another way of passing in values to a constructor. So let's call this one student as well. So how does the copy constructor work again? The object that you will be creating now is referred to as the this keyword, or the this keyword is referring to it. So we're going to say this.studentName should be the student object that was passed in's student name, and the object that you're currently creating's student number should be the student that was passed in's student number. So now we're making a copy of the one that was passed in. Right, so after this one, let's quickly create the equals method. So it's going to be public boolean equals. And remember that the equals method returns a boolean, and also it accepts a student object there. So let's just call it object. And then how does the equals method work again? Let's do a simple if statement first. If this is the calling object, dot student number is equal, so we're going to use let's just have a look at the student number quickly. You can see the student number is along there. So to compare this one, I'm not going to use an equals method, but the double equal sign. So if this dot student number is object dot student number, which means the calling object's student number, is it equal to the object that was passed in's student number? That's now only testing one, so we need to test student name as well. So we're going to say and this dot student name. Now student name is a string, and you compare strings with the equals method. So if the calling object's student name is equal to the object that was passed in, that one's student name. Okay, so if both of them are the same, then we return true. Otherwise, the else there, we will return false. Right. So remember also, this is the long way of doing it. Actually, we should not do it this way. So I'm going to remove that. I'm going to add my semicolon at the end, and I'll just return this part. So that is then returning whatever this Boolean equation or this Boolean expression will return. We will return as well. Then let's just create the getters and the setters quickly. So you can right click and say generate there, and you can say getter and setter, and choose your getter and setter for those two, and it creates the getter as well as the setters for us. So there we've got the whole complete class. So the only thing that we still need to do here is actually the toString method. So let's just quickly create the toString method. So it's going to be public string toString. And because we're overriding this, we add the @override tag there, and then we return basically information about this object, which is the student name and the student number. So we can say return student information, and then going to a new line, and let's add then the student name and a new line character so that we have the information on a new line, and then we're going to say student number and show the student number. Right, so there's a complete class with the copy constructor, with a normal constructor, with all the getters and the setters, with an equals method and a toString method. Okay, so the subject class and the student class are now done. That takes me now to the next part, where we will look at the exam paper class and a concept that we call aggregation in Java. Okay, so what is aggregation? If you look at this class, you can see we've also got 3 fields in this class. But the funny thing here is that 2 of the fields, one is of type student, which is my student class, and one is of type subject, which is my subject class. So aggregation occurs in Java when we've got fields in one class that are in fact objects of another class. That we call aggregation. So now I'm going to create a constructor in this class. So if we create the constructor, it's actually easy to do, to just right click and say generate and create the constructor for you. Now you can see that the constructor or the auto-generated constructor here sets our student to the student that was passed in, sets our subject to the subject that was passed in, and set our marks to the marks that was passed in. So one thing to remember here is that in Java we actually do not set the values directly, but we rather set copies of the values. For example, if I'm passing in a new student object here, then this student reference variable will hold the memory location of the object. Also the one that you passed in here will hold the reference. Because remember, what you're passing into a method, if you're working with objects, are actually the memory locations. So now what happens here is that the variable that was passed in will hold the memory location. This student variable will hold a memory location, as well as this student will also hold the exact same memory location. So you've got 3 reference variables now referencing the exact same object. So this is where they say we should have some security, and instead of just accepting this student object as it is, let's make a copy of it first. So we make a copy of it by using the student class's copy constructor. So if you go back to the student class, you'll remember that we did the student copy constructor there. So we're using the copy constructor to first make a copy of the one that was passed in, and then assigning it to our student reference variable. So the same for the subject there. The subject gets passed in, but instead of taking it as it is, let's create an exact copy of that one that was passed in, and then have our subject refer that one. Okay, so it can't be new student, should be new subject. Right, there we go. So the student, our student variable there, should reference the one that was passed in, but a copy of the one that was passed in. And our subject should refer to the subject that was passed in, a copy of it. Now, because marks are not, well, it's not a string or an int, or it's not an object type, which means I can directly assign it. no problems there. Okay, so then let's look at the getters and the setters quickly. So I'm going to create getters and setters there. So there's get student, there's set student, there's get subject, there's set subject, there's get marks, and there's set marks. Okay, so now in this object, when we get a new student, or we get the student of this object, again, we do not want to send back our original student. So when we send back an object, if I'm talking about marks there at the bottom, I can just send through the marks. Get the marks, send it through, set the marks, set the marks. But if we're looking at an object that we're passing back, it is best to pass a copy of that specific object again. So you can see again I'm using the copy constructor. So instead of sending my own student object, I'm sending a copy of the student object. Will it still be the exact same data? Yes, for sure. If your copy constructor is set up correctly, you'll have a copy of our student object. And then to set the student, the same thing. Instead of setting that value directly, we will set a copy of it, just as we did in the constructor. Same for get subject. Instead of just passing the subject, we will have a copy first and then pass through the memory location to that object, or that copied object. Now if we say set subject, the same thing again. We will have new subject there to send back, or in this case, to set a copy of the one that was passed in. Get marks is a normal primitive data type. You can take strings also as normal primitive. You don't need to make copies of strings as well. But for any other object type that you've got in your class using as an aggregation type of object, then you must remember to return copies and set copies. Now let's quickly look at the toString method. How will this one work now? So I'm going to say public string toString, and let's just add the @override notation there. And now what we will return is again information about the three values that we've got here. So now we can start off with saying exam paper information, and then just go to a new line. Now the next part, you'll see that we've got a student object and a subject object, but our student class has got its own toString method, and our subject class has got its own toString method. So the nice thing here now, because we already created those, I can actually just call student and then go to the next one, which will be subject. And then I can just add some more information. Let's put a new line there, some more information for my marks. So I'm going to say marks and then show marks. So let me just show you how this works now. Basically, it's going to print out exam paper information, go to a new line, then we print out student. So when we print out an object, it will automatically call the toString method, which means it's going to say exam paper information, go to a new line. Then when it prints out student, it goes to the student class and print out student information, student name, student number. Then it goes back. It says, okay, the next thing we need to do is to print out the subject object. It goes to the subject class, prints out subject information, subject code, subject name, go back to exam paper, print out marks, and then print out the marks variable. I'm not sure if this is going to work now. Let me just add a new line. Maybe it's not necessary for that new line character. I can't remember. But we'll check it if it prints out now. Okay, so that is the toString method then of the exam paper class. So let's go back to the driver class quickly and add some other values here. So I'm going to remove this now. So we've got a subject there. Let's create a student quickly. So I'm going to say student equals new student. Maybe we can name the student also student1. And if you look at the student constructor there, it accepts a student name and a student number. So let's say the student name will be Chuck Norris, and then the student number will be, well, some sort of number there. I'm just going to type any number there. And now you will see that my exam paper needs a student object as well as a subject object in the constructor. So that's why I need to create these two first before I can create now an exam paper object. So I'm going to say exam paper equals new exam paper. And you'll see that this exam paper accepts now as a student, a subject, and then a mark. So the student first, I'm going to pass in student 1 there. That's the student object. Let's say, look at that one again. First the student, then the subject, then the mark. So let's make sure we do it in that sequence. First the student, then the subject, then the mark. So the student is in, the subject is next, so it's subject 1, and then the mark, let's say, Chuck Norris will always get 100%, so it must be 100. Right, so exam paper equals new exam paper student 1, subject 1 as the second argument, and then the third one is your mark. So there we have created an object that contains fields which are objects in other classes. Okay, so now there's the exam paper object. So if I just say system out print line and I print out this paper object now, I will get a whole lot of information by just running that. So if I print out paper there now, it's going to run the toString method automatically of the exam paper class. So it will run this toString method, which will give us hopefully all the information. Let's look at how the information was printed there. You can see there, nicely printed out. It's got the exam paper information, student information. Chuck Norris, there's the student number. Then we've got subject information, there's the subject code, there's the subject name, and then lastly we have the marks of 100. Okay, so that's how the toString methods can really help us to print out information about a specific object. Okay, so now for the next part, let's see how we can use this paper object now in order to get some other information. So let's say I want to get the subject code, only the subject code, and basically not running the whole toString method, but just getting the subject code out of this object. So remember, this object is made up of 3 parts. It's the student object, there's a subject object, and there's marks. So marks is easy to get. But if I want to get, let's say in this case, the subject code, how will I do that? By just using or referring to the paper object there. So I need to go to the paper object, and on the paper object there's 3 methods that I can call. There's get marks, get student, and get subject. So the subject code will obviously be part of the subject object. So I'm going to call get subject, which will give me the subject, and then on that object that's now called subject there, on that subject object, there's again methods that I can use. So there's get subject code and get subject name, and the one that I want is subject code. So if we run this now, you can see that I only have printed out the subject code. Now the same thing, we can do exactly the same thing for, let's say, the student number. If I want the student number, how will I get it? By just using the paper object there. So again, the student number is part of the student object or the student class. So I'm going to say get student in this case, and then on the get student, on the student object, I'm going to call, in this case, the student number. So I'm going to call get student number. So you can see that paper is the exam paper object. But if I call paper.getSubject, then that whole part there will be the subject object. And on the subject object, I can call its getters or setters. Whereas in this case, paper is referring to the exam paper object. Paper.getStudent refers to the student object. And then I can call getStudentNumber. Right, so this is a simple example on how you can use aggregation also in classes.